Hello and welcome to another Passive Life video. So in this video I wanted to talk about replacing fossil fuel vehicles with electric vehicles and how that's going to affect the electrical grid in most countries. So the current war in the Ukraine has reignited the debate about replacing fossil fuels, and part of that means replacing fossil fuel vehicles with electric vehicles. But one of the main arguments against replacing all fossil fuel vehicles with electric vehicles is that the national grids in most countries won't be able to take such a large amount of electric vehicles all at once. Now, there is some truth in this, but that's also a very misleading statement. So people who say that we can't replace ICEs with electric vehicles are frankly delusional. At some point, all the fossil fuels that are used for ICEs are going to run out. Most estimates say that at the current rate of consumption, fossil fuels for ICE vehicles won't last more than 50 years, at which point we will have to use some other kind of energy to power our vehicles. Most likely that is going to be in the form of electric vehicles. So the question really isn't, can we replace all ICE vehicles with electric vehicles? The question is, how are we going to do it and how long will it take? So let's look at some numbers. So there is a large energy gap in the primary energy between the current electrical grid output and the amount of energy needed to replace all ICE vehicles with EVs. This is the same in all countries. The energy provided by fossil fuels in ICE vehicles is a hidden part of our energy grid, but it's a very real part. The bad news is that the energy gap is actually quite large, but the good news is, if you can call it good news, is that ICE vehicles are actually very inefficient. So the energy grids do not need to provide all of this extra power that would be missing if EVs suddenly replaced all ICEs. In fact, ICEs only convert 12 to 30% of their energy into motion depending on how fast they're traveling. This averages out at around 25% efficiency. If we compare this to the 80% efficiency of an electric vehicle, or up to 90% efficiency if they're using good regenerative braking, then we can do a small calculation and see how far we have to push the energy grid to reach this total replacement value. This is of course assuming that the electrical vehicles in question are not solar powered vehicles but standard electric vehicles. So US primary energy currently stands at about 93 quadrillion BTUs, or 27.25 trillion kilowatt hours of energy. About 26% of that is transport, which is about 7 trillion kilowatt hours. You have to take 4% of that away, that is already provided by renewables, which gives us 6.7 trillion kilowatt hours. 48% of that is road vehicles, which gives us 3.2 trillion kilowatt hours. We then have to minus 75% away from that to make up for the inefficiency of ICE vehicles, and then add on an additional 20% onto the remaining figure for the EV losses, which gives us 0.965 trillion or 965 billion kilowatt hours, which is an additional 23% on top of the 2020 energy output, which takes us to about 5.2 trillion kilowatt hours per year. Considering the US has a current generating capacity of about 1.14 billion kilowatts or 8.78 trillion kilowatt hours per year, this doesn't seem particularly concerning. But where the potential problem lies is with the peak demand. Electric vehicles, and especially superchargers, require high amounts of power, and if millions of vehicles all plug in at the same time, then this could be a potential problem. So let's take a look at the daily energy grid load, specifically in California, because California is slightly ahead of the curve, and so it's a good way of predicting what's going to happen in other countries around the world. This first line is the daily load from 2012. The second line is the daily load from 2020, and there are three important areas here to note. The first point shows us that California hasn't really changed that much. The resting load, as we might call it, has not really changed at all. The second point shows us that now a lot more people are using photovoltaics on their roofs and in their businesses. This has decreased the load dramatically in the middle of the day when the sun is shining. And perhaps the most important point is the third point. This shows us the effect of EVs on the demand. And as you can see, because most people charge their EVs overnight, 80% in fact, we are getting a sharp increase in the demand when people arrive home from work and plug in their cars to charge. Now currently in California, 12.5% of all new vehicles sold are electric vehicles or plug-in hybrids, but it still only makes up a relatively small percentage of the vehicles on the road. So this peak demand is probably going to increase unless people are given access to charging during the middle part of the day at their places of work. The red dotted line represents represents what will happen if people are not given that opportunity and the current trend continues. Currently, California has about 40 megawatts of peak capacity, but additional capacity can be imported from neighboring states. If you're trying to charge an electric vehicle at peak demand, then that will put the maximum stress on the electrical grid. However, this is the reason that off-peak rates exist. By providing cheaper rates at certain times of the day, electrical companies can shift demand so that the grid does not become overloaded. Combine that with smart grid options, like only charging your vehicle from your solar panels when it's exporting to the grid, and excessive load on the grid can be largely avoided. But for the most part, this shouldn't really matter. Of course, the theoretical scenario of instantly replacing all ICE vehicles with electric vehicles is never really going to happen. What we're going to see is a gradual increase in the number of electrical vehicles on the road. At the moment, only about 10% of vehicles sold are electrical vehicles, and so it will take some time to build up to 100%. And this gives the electrical grid time to expand. Another point that has to be taken into consideration is that most power plants don't run at full capacity. Electrical grids try to prioritize stable electrical delivery. The most stable form of electricity comes from nuclear power plants, so nuclear power plants are running at close to full capacity almost all the time. Power plants such as gas power plants are then brought in gradually and increased in power as the demand begins to peak. Alternative energy sources such as wind and solar mostly reduce the stress on the national grid by putting less demand on the existing power stations. This means that in theory there could be quite a lot of extra capacity in the national grids of a lot of countries as they expand and invest in alternative energy. And a lot of countries are investing a huge amount in alternative energy. Britain, for example, recently announced a 30 gigawatt peak wind farm, and although it won't work at full capacity all the time, 1 gigawatt is roughly the same capacity as a nuclear power station. In 2021, China invested $266 billion in renewable energy, the EU invested $219 billion, and the US invested $114 billion. In total, $755 billion was invested globally in alternative energy in 2021, which is a huge increase in investment over previous years, but still well short of the $4 trillion per year that is estimated to reach the net zero by 2050. So although we may not reach the goal of net zero by 2050, we are adding an enormous amount of electrical grid capacity every single year. Obviously, my preferred solution would simply be to replace all ICE vehicles with solar electric vehicles, such as the Aptera, but in a real world, that is unlikely to happen. But I am glad to see that many electrical vehicles are now incorporating solar panels, at least in a small way, into their designs. So to round up, we do need extra grid capacity, but the electrical grid in every country in the world is being expanded at an incredible rate. And at the current rate of electrical vehicle sales, power grid problems are unlikely to ever be a serious issue. If you'd like to learn more about solar electric vehicles, then check out the other videos. If you're interested in purchasing Aptera, please use the referral link below. That will get you $30 off the referral deposit. If you're looking for a VPN service, please check out NordVPN with the referral link below. Thanks for your time, and I hope to see you in the next video.